Hello Year 7, hope you're all well. This is Mrs Duffy back with another poetry lesson for you. So I hope you found the last video useful. This is a video for the next couple of lessons. You don't have to use it, you can just use the PowerPoint if you want. So the poem that we're going to look at today is called Grauballe Man by Seamus Heaney. And the learning objective while we're looking at this poem is to explore how knowing the context of a poem or text can help us to understand it and also to revise metaphors. So we're thinking today about context. Now we've talked about this quite a lot through Year 7, but I've got a reminder here for you from the Knowledge Organiser of what we mean by context. So the context is the circumstances in which a poem or piece of literature is written. It might be the historical background, so what was going on. It might be the political background or social background, just the way that people lived. And also within the context is the life of the poet. So what I'd like you to do is to pause the video and make sure you've got the title and the learning objective and that definition of context copied down. Good. So now what we're going to do today is we're actually going to see what it's like to read a poem that's a bit more difficult without knowing anything about it. So without knowing any context, and see what that is like. So I'm going to put the poem up on the next page and I'm going to read it through and you're going to see whether you've got any ideas what's it about. So follow as I read then. Grauballe Man. As if he had been poured in tar, he lies on a pillow of turf and seems to weep the black river of himself. The grain of his wrists is like bog oak, the ball of his heel like a basalt egg. His instep has shrunk, cold as a swan's foot or a wet swamp root. His hips are the ridge and purse of a mussel, his spine an eel arrested under a glisten of mud. The head lifts, the chin is a visor, raised above his slashed throat that has tanned and toughened. The cured wound opens inwards to a dark elderberry place, and his rusted hair a mat unlikely as a fetus's. I first saw his twisted face in a photograph, a head and shoulder out of the peat, bruised like a forceps baby. But now he lies perfected in my memory down to the red horn of his nails, hung in the scales with beauty and atrocity, with the dying gall too strictly compassed on his shield, with the actual weight of each hooded victim slashed and dumped. Now, do you feel confused? Because it can be very confusing to be reading something without any context, and that's what we're thinking today. So when I first read this poem, I was confused. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have a think about what was going on around the time that this poem was written, who the poet is, and see whether that gives us any clues about what the poem is about. So it's clear to say then that texts can be hard to understand when we don't know anything about when or why they were written. So here is a bit of context about the Grauballe Man, which should help us to understand the poem. So I'm just going to read it. If you read through what's in this blue box with me as I go along, then we can see if we can work it out. So the Grauballe Man is the name given to a body which was discovered in a Danish bog, and a bog is an area of wet, soft ground in 1952. The body is that of an early Iron Age man dating from the late 3rd century BC. The bog had preserved his body for over 2,000 years. Based on the evidence of his wounds, it seems likely that he had been killed by having his throat slit. It's thought that Grauballe Man had been a human sacrifice as part of pagan religious festival. Seamus Heaney wrote the above poem about this body, and he called it the same name, Grauballe Man. So this is something that actually happened in history. These bodies were found 2,000 years after they were put in there, and there's something about the nature of this wet, soft ground that means that the bodies didn't rot or fade away. And here on the next slide, I've got some pictures. If I can just move the slide on, let's have a go. Here we go. So look how well preserved the body is. This is what he actually looks like. So this, you can see down at this picture here on the bottom right, that really the body has been sort of kept almost as it was. I know it looks a bit weird, but not like most bodies which would disintegrate. And you can see this is his actual hair there. Look at the detail at the top right of his fingernails that have been preserved. And his foot down there, really, really clear. You can see the sort of wrinkles on the skin. And then the picture at the top left is what they think that the man must have looked like. So they did a reconstruction based on what he might look like when he was alive. So this is something that really fascinated people when these bodies were discovered. And it was about the time that Seamus Heaney was writing. And so he thought about this body and he wrote a poem about it. Now, down at the bottom here, there's a link to a short clip about it. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this book, one of these books, the Ripley's Believe It or Not. They have all these really fantastical facts in about real life things that happen that it seems hard to believe. So I can't open the link on the video, but I'll attach the link. The link is attached to the lesson. So if you want to have a quick look at that, then pause the video now and look at the YouTube link, which is attached to the lesson, which just shows you a few more pictures about where the body comes from. So now that we know a bit more about the body, what you're going to do is you're going to go back and have another look at the poem. And you can either rewind the video to do that, or you can look on the lesson where just the plain PowerPoint and PDF is attached. And you're going to think a bit harder now about what some of those bits and pieces in the poem might be. So we're looking at metaphors and similes. You can draw up a little chart like this. And if you look up here, you've got a quote from the poem, which says, as if he had been poured in tar. So you've got a simile there. He looked like he had been poured in tar. So you've got to say whether it's a simile or a metaphor. So we've got the word as, so I'm going to put simile in here. And then you're going to say what you think that tells us about the body. Well, the body is black like tar and it looks like a liquid and it may be wet because it's been in the bog. And what might it make you think of? So you're thinking about really how these bits of quotes from the poem here help you to picture the man when he's been recovered from the bog here. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video. So you're going to make a little chart. It doesn't matter if you don't have the lines. You can just write the quote, write whether it's a metaphor or simile, and you can use these sentence starters to help you think what these words, what these bits from the poem tell us about the body. Okay, so when you filled in that chart, we're now going to think a little bit about the poet, Seamus Heaney. This is also important contextual information. So it might give us a bit more of a clue as to why he's written this poem by learning something about him. So follow in the blue box while I read this information about Seamus Heaney. Seamus Heaney was born in 1939 on a farm in County Derry in Northern Ireland, and he grew up in a traditional farming community. Images from nature and his country upbringing are often seen in his poems. In later life, Heaney became a lecturer at Belfast University and then Oxford University. In the late 1960s, there were terrible political troubles in Northern Ireland with a great deal of fighting and bloodshed for nearly 40 years, and the memories of this are definitely found in Heaney's poems. Heaney was really interested in the discovery of Grauballe Man and other bog bodies. He said of them, I was terrifically entranced by the photographs, terrible as they were. The theory that they had been part of some sacrificial ritual, or part of some punishment for offences committed against the tribe, made me think of them in relation to the whole idea of self-sacrifice that had lain behind much 20th century violence. So, key things to think. Heaney grew up in the countryside. There were lots of political troubles going on, which meant that there was a lot of violence and fighting in his life when he was growing up. And he was really interested in the Grauballe Man and the fact that he'd somehow been sacrificed for the community. So, a little task for you now. We've got some facts about Seamus Heaney on the left of this chart. And we've got an aspect of the poem, something about the poem on the right, and I want you to try and link them up. What do you think it is about the poet's past that might link to something in the poem? So you can write them all out because actually one part of the sentence links to the next part of the sentence, or if you want, you can write it out like this down at the bottom. A matches to number C or B or whatever it is. Okay, but what you're thinking about is how the poet has been affected by what was going on around him when he was writing this poem, and how we might see a little bit of that in the poem. It is quite hard, but you should be able to work out the sense of the sentences by matching them up. So pause the video and have a go at that now. Right, well done everybody, you're doing really well, and this is quite a difficult poem. You don't need to understand all of the poem, but we're looking at some bits of it. And we're going to move on to a writing task, which you might start today, and then there'll be time to do in your next lesson. So we're going to write some C's paragraphs. You're going to think about what you've learned about the poem, the pictures you have in your mind about the body, what you've learned about Seamus Heaney, and you're going to answer this question: how does Seamus Heaney use imagery in the poem to help us understand the story of Grauballe Man? So if you pause the video now and just write that title there, copy that into your books. Okay, so you've already looked at the imagery. Remember, imagery is just a word to group together metaphors and similes and personification. So the chart you've just filled in, this one here, you're going to be able to use that. These can be the quotes you use in your C's paragraphs, and you've got some ideas about what they tell us. So you can either have a go at doing this on your own, because you've done lots of practice with C's paragraphs, and I know that you're all getting quite good, or you can use the sentence starters on the next page. But you should try to include everything you've learned about the poem in your paragraph, and a lot of you need to be moving on to the second and third paragraph to really show what you've understood about the poem. So on the next page, if you're really stuck, is some help. So it might be that you just want to use this down the edge to remind you that you need to have a statement, then evidence, then inference, and then zoom, and then explain a bit about the history and a bit about the poet. But you might think that you want to use these blue sentence starters as well. So you start with the blue, and then in this instance, you're going to pick the technique from the chart you want to talk about. You're going to put your quotation in here, and then you're going to explain what you think it helps you to understand about the bog body, about Seamus Heaney, and what was happening at the time that he was writing. So you've got some help there. You need to pause the video now and have a go at least one C's paragraph. But if you're still in the first lesson, you should be doing 2 or 3. And those of you who are challenging yourselves to be the best that you can be and know that you can do more than one should really be moving on to doing more. If you are feeling confident, try to make sure you've written a paragraph for each of the techniques that Heaney has used, and try to adapt your own sentence starters. That's another challenge. Don't use the same sentence starters all the time. And if you finish early in the second lesson, then there's some information, lots of information about the bog bodies online. I think it's a really interesting topic. It's linked really nicely to science as well, and a bit of geography. So there's another YouTube video which I will is attached to the lesson. You won't be able to click on it from here, about Grauballe Man, another of the famous bog bodies that Seamus Heaney wrote about. That's a picture of him there. And if you've got time, then I'd like you to try and find out 10 facts about Grauballe Man and the other bog bodies that were found, and write those into your books. So well done today. It is a tricky poem, and we've done that on purpose because we want you to understand how a hard poem can become a little easier to understand when you understand the context. You understand when it was written, why it was written, and who wrote it. Okay, well done Year 7. See you next time.